You think you know the worst decisions in history. The atomic bomb, starting World War I. But there's one choice that killed more people than both world wars combined, and you've probably never even heard of it. Four men sat in a room in 1958, and what they decided in the next few hours would lead to the deaths of somewhere between 15 and 55 million people. Maybe more. We'll never know the exact number because there were too many bodies to count. This isn't a story about war. It's not about some crazy dictator pressing a nuclear button or sending armies across borders. This is about something way more disturbing. Four guys in suits looking at charts and numbers, making what they thought was a smart decision about farming. Just farming. And somehow that one meeting, that one choice, turned into the largest man-made disaster in human history. The scary part? They thought they were helping. They genuinely believed they were about to make life better for hundreds of millions of people. I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, step by step. And by the end, you're going to understand how something that started with good intentions became a nightmare that still haunts China today. Because this story isn't really about the decision itself. It's about what happens when leaders refuse to admit they're wrong, when pride becomes more important than human lives, and when an entire country becomes trapped in a lie so big that telling the truth means certain death. Let me take you back to China in the late 1950s. The country had just gone through a massive revolution. The Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, had taken control in 1949 after years of civil war. The old imperial system was gone. The nationalists had fled to Taiwan. And now Mao and his party were in charge of the most populated country on earth, and they had big plans, really big plans. See, China had always been this agricultural society. For thousands of years, Chinese farmers had been growing rice and wheat and millet using pretty much the same methods their ancestors used. It worked kind of. People weren't starving most of the time, but they weren't exactly thriving either. China was poor, really poor. Most people were farmers living in small villages, barely making enough to feed their families. There was no industry to speak of, no factories, no steel mills, nothing like what was happening in America or Europe or even in the Soviet Union. And that bothered Mao a lot. He looked at the Soviet Union and saw how they had transformed from a backward agricultural country into an industrial superpower in just a few decades. He wanted that for China. He wanted China to catch up with the West, to become powerful and respected, to prove that communism could work even better than capitalism. But there was a problem. Actually, there were a lot of problems, but the biggest one was this: how do you build an industrial economy when most of your people are farmers? The Soviet Union had solved this problem in a pretty brutal way. They had collectivized agriculture, which meant they took land away from individual farmers and created these massive collective farms run by the state. Then they squeezed those farms for everything they could get, taking food from the countryside to feed workers in the cities who were building factories and making steel. Millions of people died in the process, especially in Ukraine during what's called the Holodomor, but from Stalin's perspective, it worked. The Soviet Union became an industrial power. Mao wanted to do the same thing, but faster. He didn't want to spend decades slowly building up industry. He wanted to leapfrog straight to being a major world power. And he thought he had figured out a way to do it. In 1958, he announced something called the Great Leap Forward. The name itself tells you everything about what he was trying to do. Not a gradual improvement. Not a careful plan, a leap. A giant sudden jump from agricultural society to industrial powerhouse. The basic idea was this: China would collectivize its farms even more than it already had, organizing farmers into huge communes of thousands or even tens of thousands of people. These communes would produce tons of food using new scientific farming methods. At the same time, everyone would help build industry. Farmers would smelt steel in backyard furnaces. They'd build dams and irrigation systems. They'd work day and night to transform China into a modern nation. And it would all happen incredibly fast, in just a few years. Now here's where we get to that room with those four men and the decision that killed millions. Because central to the whole Great Leap Forward was the idea that Chinese agriculture could be revolutionized almost overnight using science. Not traditional farming knowledge that had been built up over centuries, but new communist science that would prove superior to everything that came before. Mao wasn't a farmer. He wasn't a scientist either. But he was absolutely convinced that he understood agriculture better than the farmers did. And he surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear. One of these people was a guy named Trofim Lysenko. a Soviet scientist who had all these wild ideas about genetics and agriculture that the actual scientific community thought were completely wrong. But Stalin had loved Lysenko's ideas because they fit with communist ideology, and now Mao loved them too. Lysenko and his followers claimed that plants of the same species wouldn't compete with each other for resources. They said you could plant seeds incredibly close together, way closer than traditional farmers ever did, and the plants would actually help each other grow instead of competing. They called this close planting, and they promised it would multiply crop yields by enormous amounts. Instead of planting rice seeds a certain distance apart like farmers had done forever, you could plant them practically on top of each other and get way more rice from the same amount of land. This is where we get to the meeting I mentioned at the start. In August of 1958, Mao called together a small group of his top agricultural officials at a resort town called Beidaihe. This wasn't a big formal conference with hundreds of people. It was intimate. Just Mao and a handful of his closest advisors, including the 4 men who would make the crucial decisions. They spent several days there discussing how to implement the Great Leap Forward in agriculture. And in one of those meetings, they made a choice that would doom millions. They decided that close planting would become mandatory across all of China. Not optional. Not experimental. Mandatory. Farmers would be required to plant their seeds at extremely high densities, much higher than they had ever used before. The officials decided on specific numbers, specific densities that every commune would have to achieve. And they decided this would start immediately, with the very next planting season. Think about what that means for a second. China had hundreds of millions of farmers who had been working the land their whole lives, whose families had been farming the same plots for generations. They knew their soil, they knew their climate. They knew what worked and what didn't. And now a handful of guys who had probably never planted a single seed in their lives were telling them to completely change everything they knew about farming, all at once across the entire country. But it gets worse. Because close planting wasn't the only new technique they mandated. They also decided that fields should be plowed much deeper than traditional methods. Like way deeper. The idea was that deeper plowing would allow roots to grow deeper and access more nutrients. They called for plowing more than a meter deep in some cases, which is completely insane if you know anything about soil. But the order went out anyway. They also promoted something called the 4 Pests campaign. Someone had decided that sparrows were a major pest because they ate grain seeds. So the government ordered everyone to kill sparrows. And I mean everyone. Entire villages would spend days banging pots and pans to keep sparrows from landing until the birds died from exhaustion. People shot them, poisoned them, destroyed their nests. Within a year, the sparrow population in China was nearly wiped out. Sounds like a victory, right? Get rid of the pests, save the grain. Except sparrows don't just eat grain seeds. They also eat insects. Lots of insects. And with the sparrows gone, the insect population exploded. Locusts in particular went crazy, swarming over fields and eating everything in sight. The thing that was supposed to protect the crops ended up making everything worse. But back to the meeting at Beidaihe. The decision had been made. Close planting was now policy. Deep plowing was mandatory. Kill the sparrows. And there was one more element that made everything even more catastrophic. The grain quota system. See, the communes weren't just supposed to grow food for themselves. They were supposed to produce a surplus that could be taken by the state. This grain would feed workers in the cities, be exported to earn foreign currency, and generally fuel the Great Leap Forward. So each commune was assigned a quota. A specific amount of grain they had to hand over to the government. In theory, this quota was based on how much the commune could reasonably produce. In reality, the quotas were set absurdly high because the officials in charge wanted to impress their superiors by showing huge production increases. And here's where things got really dark. The commune leaders were pressured to report that they were meeting or exceeding their quotas, whether they actually were or not. If you reported failure, if you said your commune couldn't meet its quota, you were accused of being a counter-revolutionary. You were accused of sabotaging the Great Leap Forward. You could be arrested, beaten, killed. So what did commune leaders do? They lied. They reported massive harvests that didn't exist. They said they had doubled or tripled their grain production, when in reality, the harvest was worse than before. And because everyone was lying, nobody at the top knew how bad things really were. Or maybe some of them knew and were too scared to say anything. Either way, the lies kept going up the chain of command. Meanwhile, back in the actual fields, the new farming methods were failing spectacularly. The close planting didn't make plants help each other. It made them compete viciously for water and nutrients and sunlight. The stalks grew thin and weak. The grain heads were small and poorly formed. When harvest time came, the yields were terrible. In many places they were worse than they'd been in decades. The deep plowing was even more disastrous. In much of China, the topsoil is only so deep. Below that is subsoil, that's much less fertile. When farmers plowed super deep, they brought that infertile subsoil to the surface and buried the good topsoil underneath. They literally turned their fields upside down, putting the worst soil on top where the crops were trying to grow. It would take years for the soil to recover from this, and that's assuming anyone survived long enough to fix it. And remember those backyard steel furnaces I mentioned? That turned into its own nightmare. Mao decided that China needed to massively increase steel production to fuel industrialization. But there weren't enough proper steel mills, so he ordered communes to build small furnaces and smelt steel themselves. Millions of these little furnaces popped up all over China. People melted down their farming tools, their pots and pans, anything metal they could find. And what did these backyard furnaces produce? Mostly useless slag. The steel was such poor quality that it couldn't be used for anything. Meanwhile, the time people spent tending these furnaces was time they weren't spending on farming. And they had burned their tools to feed the furnaces, so even when they tried to farm, they had nothing to work with. It was insanity on top of insanity. By late 1958, just a few months after that meeting at Beidaihe, the agricultural situation in China was already getting bad. The fall harvest was poor. But the government was collecting grain based on the inflated production reports, not the actual harvest. So if a commune had actually produced 10,000 tons of grain but reported 20,000, the government would come and take quotas based on that 20,000 figure. They'd take everything. Sometimes they'd take more than the commune had actually produced, forcing people to hand over seed grain that was supposed to be saved for next year's planting. People started going hungry. At first it was just uncomfortable, smaller portions, less variety in the diet. But it got worse fast. By winter, people in some areas were starving. And I don't mean hungry. I mean actually starving to death. They ate the bark off trees, they ate grass. They ate dirt mixed with any scrap of food they could find. They boiled leather to make soup. Parents watched their children waste away and couldn't do anything because there was no food. And still the government kept collecting grain. Still the commune leaders kept reporting huge successes. Because to admit failure was to die, and maybe if they could just hold on a little longer, things would get better. Maybe the next harvest would be good. Maybe the close planting would work if they just tried harder. It didn't get better. It got worse. Way worse. 1959 came. Spring planting happened. But many communes didn't have enough seed grain because it had all been taken by the government or eaten by desperate people. The fields were in terrible condition from the deep plowing and the close planting. There weren't enough tools. There weren't enough animals because people had eaten them. And everyone was weak from hunger, too exhausted to work properly. The summer harvest of 1959 was catastrophic. In many areas, crop yields were half or less of what they'd been before the Great Leap Forward. But you know what happened? The government collected even more grain than the year before. Because the reported yields kept going up, so the quotas kept going up, and nobody dared to tell the truth. By the end of 1959, full-blown famine had spread across huge parts of China. Entire villages were dying. Not just individuals here and there. Entire villages. Everyone. In some places, the only people left alive were the party officials who had access to hidden grain stores. The stories from this period are almost impossible to believe. People were so hungry that they stopped being able to think clearly. Starvation does that to your brain. Your body starts breaking down muscle tissue for energy. Your organs start to shut down. You get these weird symptoms like your legs swelling up with fluid, your hair falls out. You can't sleep, but you can't stay awake either. You exist in this horrible foggy state where everything hurts and you can't remember what it felt like to not be hungry. And people did terrible things because of it. There are documented cases of cannibalism, parents eating dead children, people killing each other for scraps of food. This wasn't widespread, but the fact that it happened at all tells you how bad things got. When people are driven to cannibalism, you're looking at a level of desperation that's hard to even imagine. The government knew something was wrong by this point. You can't hide millions of people starving to death completely. Reports were coming in from some areas about food shortages. But the full scale of the disaster was still hidden by the layers of lies. Lower officials lied to their superiors. Those superiors lied to their superiors. And at the very top, Mao was being told that the Great Leap Forward was a huge success. There's this famous story about Mao visiting communes during this period. The local officials would put on these elaborate shows for him. They'd take healthy-looking people from other areas and have them stand in the fields pretending to work. They'd pile grain up to make it look like there was a huge harvest. They'd prepare feasts to serve Mao while people a few miles away were eating tree bark. And Mao would tour these fake showcase communes and be told everything was wonderful, and he'd go back to Beijing believing it. But some truth was getting through. In 1959, there was this guy named Beidaihe, who was one of the top military leaders in China. He'd been a revolutionary hero, fought alongside Mao for decades. And he started hearing about the famine. He went to some rural areas and saw what was really happening, and he was horrified. So Peng did something incredibly brave and incredibly stupid. He wrote a letter to Mao criticizing the Great Leap Forward. He didn't attack Mao directly, but he pointed out that the new agricultural policies weren't working. He said the backyard steel furnaces were a waste. He suggested that maybe they should go back to more traditional farming methods. He was polite about it. He was careful. But he was basically saying that Mao's signature policy was failing. Mao's response? He went absolutely ballistic. He called a big party meeting and denounced Peng as a right-wing opportunist who was trying to sabotage the revolution. He accused Peng of conspiring with foreign enemies. He basically destroyed Peng's career and had him purged from leadership. And the message to everyone else was crystal clear. If even someone as senior and respected as Beidaihe could be destroyed for criticizing the Great Leap Forward, then nobody was safe. Keep your mouth shut. Keep reporting success. Don't tell Mao the truth. So the famine continued into 1960. And 1960 was the worst year, the very worst. By this point, the entire agricultural system had collapsed. There was no seed grain to plant. The soil was ruined. The tools were gone. The animals were dead. The people who weren't dead were too weak to work. And still the government kept taking whatever tiny amount of food was produced. In some provinces, more than 10% of the entire population died. Think about that. 1 out of every 10 people. Gone. In places like Anhui and Sichuan, the death rates were even higher. There are counties where 30 or 40% of the population died. Entire families, entire bloodlines wiped out. And it was so preventable. That's the thing that makes this so horrible. China had grain. Not in the countryside where people were starving, but in government warehouses. Grain that had been collected from previous harvests. Grain that was being saved for export or for feeding city workers or for military reserves. If the government had just admitted there was a famine and distributed that stored grain, millions of lives could have been saved. But they didn't, because admitting there was a famine would mean admitting the Great Leap Forward had failed. And Mao couldn't admit that. His entire authority was based on being the great leader who was transforming China. If the Great Leap Forward failed, if his policies had caused millions of deaths, then what did that say about him? What did that say about the communist revolution? So the official line remained that everything was fine. There were occasional mentions of natural disasters or food shortages in certain areas, but never an admission that there was a massive famine caused by government policy. The propaganda kept showing happy farmers bringing in record harvests. The newspapers kept printing stories about the success of the communes. And people kept dying. It was not until 1961 that the government finally started backing off from the most extreme policies of the Great Leap Forward. They quietly allowed communes to go back to more traditional farming methods. They stopped the close planting mandates. They stopped the deep plowing requirements. They disbanded many of the backyard steel furnaces. And slowly, very slowly, food production started to recover. But the damage was done. Between 15 and 55 million people had died. The range is so huge because nobody really knows. The government didn't keep accurate records. In many areas, there was nobody left alive to count the dead. Entire villages had been abandoned, everyone dead or fled, and years later when people came back, they'd just find skeletons and ruins. Think about those numbers for a second. 15 million at the low end. That's more than the number of soldiers who died in World War I. 55 million at the high end. That's more than the total deaths, military and civilian, in World War II. And it all came from one decision about how close together to plant seeds. Well, okay, it wasn't just that one decision. It was a whole series of bad decisions. The close planting, the deep plowing, the sparrow killing, the backyard furnaces, the grain quotas, the propaganda system that made it impossible to tell the truth. The political culture where admitting mistakes meant death. All of it together created this perfect storm of disaster. But it started with that meeting at Beidaihe. That's when the key agricultural policies of the Great Leap Forward were finalized. That's when Mao and his advisors decided to ignore traditional farming knowledge and impose their ideological theories on hundreds of millions of people. They could have run experiments. They could have tried the new methods in a few places and seen if they worked before rolling them out everywhere. They could have listened to farmers who said this was a bad idea. They didn't. They were so convinced they were right, so certain that communist science was superior to traditional knowledge, that they bet the lives of millions of people on untested theories. And when those theories failed, they couldn't admit it because their entire political system was built on the idea that the party was always right and Mao was always right and communism was always right. The Great Leap Forward officially ended in 1962. Mao stepped back from day-to-day management of the economy, though he remained the supreme leader. Some of his colleagues, like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, took over economic policy and started implementing more practical reforms. They let farmers have private plots where they could grow food for themselves. They stopped the craziest policies. They focused on actually feeding people instead of on ideological purity. But nobody talked about what had happened. Nobody admitted that there had been a massive famine. Nobody counted the dead. Nobody held anyone accountable. The whole thing was basically covered up. In official histories, this period was referred to as the 3 years of natural disasters, as if the deaths had been caused by weather rather than policy. It was until after Mao died in 1976 that the Chinese government even began to acknowledge what had really happened. And even then it took years. Slowly, scholars started researching the famine. Survivors started telling their stories. The death toll started to be calculated. And the truth came out. This was the deadliest man-made disaster in human history, caused not by war or genocide in the traditional sense, but by a combination of ideological rigidity, political cowardice, and the unwillingness of leaders to admit they were wrong. There's this quote from Deng Xiaoping, who eventually became China's leader in the 1980s. He said that the problem with the Great Leap Forward was that they tried to do everything too fast, that they didn't investigate conditions carefully, that they ignored reality. But even he never fully placed blame where it belonged. He never said that Mao was responsible for tens of millions of deaths. That was too dangerous politically, even decades later. The survivors of the famine carried the trauma with them for the rest of their lives. There are studies showing that people who lived through it had lasting health problems. The children who were born during the famine years had higher rates of all kinds of diseases later in life because their mothers were malnourished during pregnancy. The psychological scars ran deep too. An entire generation grew up having watched their families starve to death, and they never forgot it. And here's something that should terrify you: the same patterns keep repeating throughout history. Leaders make decisions based on ideology instead of reality. They surround themselves with yes-men who tell them what they want to hear. They create systems where telling the truth is dangerous and covering up problems is rewarded. And then when disaster strikes, they blame anything but their own policies. The Great Leap Forward wasn't unique in that sense. The Holodomor in Ukraine had similar characteristics. So did various famines in British-ruled India. So did famines in North Korea in the 1990s. The details differ, but the pattern is the same. Leaders prioritize their political goals over human lives. The truth gets suppressed, and millions die preventable deaths. What makes the Great Leap Forward stand out is just the sheer scale. 15 to 55 million deaths over 3 years. That's 5 to 18 million deaths per year. That's somewhere between 14,000 and 50,000 people dying every single day for 3 years straight. Every day, day after day after day, for 3 years. And it could have been stopped at any point. That's the thing that haunts you when you really think about this story. At any point during those 3 years, the Chinese government could have admitted there was a problem. They could have stopped collecting grain from starving villages. They could have opened up the warehouses. And they could have asked for international aid. They could have done something. But they didn't, because the political cost of admitting failure was considered higher than the cost of millions of human lives. Let me say that again. The government chose to let millions of people starve to death rather than admit that their policies had failed. That's not an exaggeration. That's not me being dramatic. That's literally what happened. And Mao? He never admitted it was his fault, never apologized, never took responsibility. In 1962, at a party conference after the worst of the famine was over, he gave this speech where he said something like, "We did make some mistakes, but they were mistakes of inexperience, and we've learned from them." That was it. That was his acknowledgement that tens of millions of people had died because of policies he had championed. Mistakes of inexperience. We've learned from them. Moving on, he stayed in power for another 14 years. And in the late 1960s, he launched another massive political campaign called the Cultural Revolution that caused even more chaos and death, though nothing on the scale of the Great Leap Forward. He died in 1976, still revered by millions of Chinese people, still the great founder of modern China, still someone whose portrait hangs in Tiananmen Square. There's something profoundly disturbing about that. About the fact that you can be responsible for the largest man-made disaster in history and still be honored. Still be respected. Still have your face on the money. It tells you something about how power works and how history gets written and how societies deal with or fail to deal with their past traumas. China today doesn't really talk about the Great Leap Forward. It's not censored exactly, but it's not something you learn much about in school, either. If you ask people in China about it, especially young people, a lot of them don't know the details. They might know there was a famine in the late 50s and early 60s, but they don't know how bad it was or why it happened. The official version is still that natural disasters were mostly to blame, though historians are now allowed to say that policy mistakes contributed. The thing is, the Great Leap Forward isn't ancient history. It happened in the lifetime of people who are still alive today. There are survivors who remember it. There are people in their 60s and 70s who were children during the famine and watched their siblings die of starvation. This isn't some distant medieval event. This is modern history. And that brings us to the real lesson here, the thing that makes this story relevant today. Because the Great Leap Forward happened in a specific time and place with specific circumstances, but the underlying dynamics could happen anywhere. Anytime you have a political system where leaders can't be challenged, where telling the truth is dangerous, where ideology overrides reality, where short-term political considerations outweigh human welfare, you're setting up the conditions for disaster. It doesn't have to be about farming. It could be about anything. It could be about pandemic response or climate policy or economic management or military strategy. Any situation where leaders need accurate information to make good decisions. But the system encourages people to lie and hide problems rather than confronting them honestly. The specific form will be different in different places. China in the 1950s was a very particular kind of authoritarian system. But the basic problem of leaders making bad decisions and then being unable or unwilling to reverse course because of political considerations, that's universal. That can happen in any political system if the incentives are wrong. Think about it this way. At every stage of the Great Leap Forward, there were people who knew what was happening. The farmers knew the close planting wasn't working. Local officials knew people were starving. Provincial leaders knew the reported harvest figures were fake. People at high levels of government suspected something was very wrong. But each person in that chain had strong incentives to keep quiet and pass the lies upward. The farmer who questioned close planting would be attacked by his neighbors and the local party boss. The local official who reported a bad harvest would be accused of sabotage. The provincial leader who contradicted Mao's policies would be purged like Peng Dehuai. And Mao himself had built his entire reputation on being the wise leader who was transforming China. So admitting the Great Leap Forward was a disaster would undermine everything. Everyone in the system had good reasons, from their own perspective, to lie or stay silent. And when everyone makes that individually rational choice, you get collectively insane outcomes. Tens of millions of people die because each individual in the chain was just trying to protect themselves. That's the real horror of the Great Leap Forward. It wasn't caused by one evil person twirling a mustache and deciding to kill millions of people. It was caused by a system that made it rational for everyone to behave in ways that led to disaster. Mao wasn't trying to kill people. The officials at Beidaihe weren't trying to cause a famine. They genuinely thought their policies would work. And when the policies failed, everyone was trapped by the system they'd created. Now you might be thinking, okay, this is all very interesting history. But what am I supposed to do with this information? Why does it matter today? And that's a fair question. The Great Leap Forward happened 70 years ago in a country with a very different political system than most of us live in. So what's the relevance? Here's what I think. The Great Leap Forward shows us what happens at the extreme end of a spectrum of bad governance. But the same principles apply in less extreme cases too. Anytime you see leaders who are more concerned with saving face than solving problems, that's dangerous. Anytime you see a culture where people are afraid to deliver bad news to their bosses, that's dangerous. Anytime you see decisions being made based on what's politically convenient rather than what's actually true, that's dangerous. And those patterns exist everywhere to some degree. They exist in corporations where executives shoot the messenger who tells them about problems. They exist in militaries where junior officers are afraid to contradict senior ones even when the seniors are wrong. They exist in governments of all types when politicians care more about winning the next election than about long-term consequences of their policies. The Great Leap Forward is just the most extreme example of what happens when these tendencies run completely unchecked. It's what happens when there are no safeguards, no mechanisms for correcting course, no way for truth to reach the people who need to hear it. So when you hear about this story, when you think about those 15 to 55 million people who died, don't just think of it as a tragedy that happened long ago in a faraway place. Think of it as a warning. A warning about what can happen when leaders prioritize their own political survival over human welfare. A warning about what can happen when systems make it dangerous to tell the truth. A warning about what can happen when ideology overrides reality. And think about what you can do in your own life, in your own context, to make sure those patterns don't take hold. Maybe that means speaking up when you see problems even if it's uncomfortable. Maybe that means creating space for other people to tell you hard truths. Maybe that means being willing to admit when you're wrong instead of doubling down. Maybe that means supporting institutions and norms that encourage honesty and accountability. Because the alternative is accepting that something like the Great Leap Forward could happen again. Maybe not in the exact same way, maybe not killing tens of millions of people. But the same basic dynamic of bad decisions compounded by lies, compounded by political cowardice, leading to preventable disaster. That can happen. It has happened. It will happen again unless we actively work to prevent it. The four men who sat in that room at Beidaihe in 1958 didn't think they were making a decision that would kill millions. They thought they were making a smart choice that would help China leap forward into modernity. They were wrong, catastrophically, horrifyingly wrong. And because the political system they were part of made it impossible to admit error and change course, that one bad decision turned into the deadliest man-made disaster in human history. Let me tell you about some of the individual stories from this period, because numbers alone don't capture the real human cost. There was a woman named Yang Shanhui who decades later wrote a book collecting oral histories from survivors. One story she documented was about a mother who had 3 children. The youngest was maybe 2 years old. The family had run out of food completely. The mother would go out every day trying to find anything edible. Tree bark, roots, grass, anything. And every day she'd come back with less and less. One morning she woke up and her youngest child had died during the night. Just stopped breathing, starved to death in his sleep. And you know what she did? She couldn't bury him. The ground was frozen and she didn't have the strength to dig anyway. So she just left him there in the house and went back out looking for food for her other 2 children. When she came back that evening, the body was gone. Her older children had eaten their dead brother because they were so hungry they couldn't think straight anymore. That mother survived the famine. She lived for decades after. But imagine carrying that memory with you for the rest of your life. Imagine knowing that your children were so desperate that they ate their own sibling. Imagine the guilt and the horror and the trauma. And then imagine that the government that caused this never apologized, never acknowledged it. Just moved on and expected everyone to pretend it didn't happen. That's just one story, one family. Multiply that by millions, and you start to get a sense of what happened during those 3 years. The thing is, most of these stories were never recorded. Most of the people who died left no record at all. No graves, no death certificates, no nothing. They just disappeared. Entire families vanished, and nobody even knows their names. There were some areas where the death rate got so high that the living could keep up with burying the dead. Bodies would just be left where they fell. In the streets, in the fields, in homes, and after a while people became numb to it. You'd walk past dead bodies on your way to try to find food and you wouldn't even react because it was so common. Death became normal, expected, just part of daily life. The psychological impact of living through something like that is hard to overstate. Humans aren't meant to experience that level of suffering and death. Our brains aren't built to process watching everyone around us die while we're powerless to help. A lot of survivors developed what we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Depression, Anxiety, survivor's guilt. Why did I live when my children died? Why did I survive when my whole village is gone? Questions like that haunted people for the rest of their lives. And remember, this wasn't happening in some remote corner of the world that nobody knew about. This was happening in a country with 600 million people. This was happening in villages and towns all across China. Millions of people knew what was happening. They just couldn't talk about it. They had to pretend everything was fine because speaking the truth meant death. There are accounts of people being executed for talking about the famine. Not for causing it, not for stealing food, just for talking about it. For saying out loud that people were starving. Because acknowledging the famine meant contradicting the official line that the Great Leap Forward was a success. And contradicting the party line was counter-revolutionary. A crime punishable by death. So people died in silence. They starved quietly. They watched their families die and said nothing. Because what could they say? Who could they tell? The government already knew and didn't care. Your neighbors were in the same situation. And if you spoke up, you just get yourself killed without helping anyone. Think about the complete breakdown of social norms that happened during this period. In normal times, people help each other. If your neighbor is struggling, you share what you have. Communities come together during hard times. But during the Great Leap Forward famine, that all broke down. When everyone is starving, there's nothing to share. When your own children are dying, you can't spare food for your neighbor's children. Social bonds that had held communities together for generations just dissolved. People became suspicious of each other. If your neighbor seemed to have food, where did they get it? Did they steal it? Did they inform on someone to the party officials in exchange for rations? Did they eat someone? The social fabric that makes human society work just completely fell apart in many areas. And the saddest part is that it didn't have to be this way. The famine wasn't caused by drought or floods or locusts or any natural disaster. Those things happened too, but they weren't the main cause. The main cause was policy, human decisions. Choices made by people who had the power to make different choices. China had enough food to feed everyone if it had been distributed properly, but the food was in the wrong places. It was in government warehouses. It was in the cities. It was being exported overseas. Meanwhile, the countryside where the food was grown was starving because the government had taken everything. There's this concept in economics called market failure, where the free market doesn't allocate resources efficiently and people suffer as a result. The Great Leap Forward was the opposite. It was government failure on a massive scale. The complete breakdown of any rational system for growing food and getting it to people who needed it. And unlike market failures, which can sometimes be fixed by government intervention, this was a case where the government was the problem. The more control the government had, the worse things got. The question that keeps coming up when people study the Great Leap Forward is, how could this happen? How could educated, intelligent people make such terrible decisions and then stick with them even as millions died? And I think there are a few answers to that. First, there's the ideology problem. The people making decisions were true believers in communism. They believed that communist principles were scientifically correct and that following those principles would necessarily lead to good outcomes. So when reality contradicted their ideology, they assumed reality was wrong. The peasants must be hiding grain. The local officials must be sabotaging things. The problem couldn't be with the ideology itself because the ideology was scientific truth. This is a trap that any ideological system can fall into, by the way. It doesn't have to be communism. Anytime you have a system where questioning core beliefs is forbidden or dangerous, where ideology overrides evidence, you're setting up the same dynamic. People stop thinking critically. They stop asking whether their assumptions are correct. They just keep doubling down on failed policies because admitting failure would mean admitting their whole worldview is wrong. Second, there's the information problem. The people at the top genuinely didn't know how bad things were because everyone below them was lying. And they were lying because the system punished honesty and rewarded false optimism. This created a feedback loop where the worse things got, the more people lied about it, which meant the leaders at the top had even less accurate information, which meant they couldn't fix the problems even if they wanted to. This is why freedom of speech and freedom of the press are so important, by the way. Not just as abstract rights, but as practical mechanisms for making sure leaders get accurate information. When you can't speak freely, when journalists can't report truthfully, when criticism is forbidden, the people in charge end up living in a bubble of their own propaganda. They literally don't know what's happening in their own country. There's the pride and ego problem. Mao had staked his entire reputation on the Great Leap Forward. He told everyone it would work. He'd criticized people who expressed doubts. He'd purged officials who questioned him. So when it started to fail, admitting that would mean admitting he'd been wrong about everything. It would mean losing face in a culture where face was incredibly important. It would mean potentially losing power. So instead of admitting failure, he doubled down. He blamed saboteurs. He blamed bad weather. He blamed anyone but himself and his policies. And because he was the supreme leader, because he had absolute power, there was no one who could force him to face reality. He was surrounded by people who depended on him for their own power and position, so they had every incentive to support his delusions rather than contradict him. This is why checks and balances matter. Why separation of powers matters. Why having multiple centers of authority matters. Not just as abstract principles of government, but as practical safeguards against exactly this kind of disaster. When power is concentrated in one person or one group, when there are no institutional mechanisms for challenging bad decisions, you get the Great Leap Forward. Fourth, there's the momentum problem. Once the policies were in place, once millions of people had been mobilized, once the propaganda machine was in full gear, it became very hard to change course. Bureaucracies have inertia. Policies have momentum. And the bigger the policy, the harder it is to stop or reverse. The Great Leap Forward wasn't just a few directives from Beijing. It was a massive mobilization of the entire country. Millions of people working on projects. Entire provinces reorganized. The whole economic system restructured. Stopping all that and admitting it was a mistake would have been incredibly difficult even if Mao had wanted to do it. Which he didn't. But even if he had, the sheer momentum of what had been set in motion would have made changing course extremely hard. This is a problem in any large organization or system. Once you've committed to a course of action, once you've invested resources and reputation into it, admitting failure and changing direction becomes harder and harder the longer you go. This is why it's so important to build in checkpoints and evaluation mechanisms from the start. To have clear metrics for success and failure. To have decision points where you can stop and reassess. Without those, you can end up locked into a disastrous course of action just because the momentum is too strong to overcome. Fifth, and maybe most important, there's the empathy problem. The people making decisions were far removed from the consequences. Mao wasn't starving. The officials in Beijing weren't starving. Their families weren't dying. They had access to food. They had comfortable lives. The suffering was happening far away in rural villages to people they never met. It's just a lot easier to keep implementing policies that kill people when you don't have to see the bodies. When you don't have to look into the eyes of starving children. When the deaths are just numbers on a report, if they're reported at all. There's a famous quote possibly misattributed to Stalin. One death is a tragedy. 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic. And that's what happened during the Great Leap Forward. The deaths became statistics, if that, abstract numbers that didn't feel real to the people making decisions. This distance between decision makers and consequences is a fundamental problem in large-scale governance. The people with the power to help are usually the people furthest from the suffering. They make decisions based on reports and data and theories, not based on direct observation of how those decisions affect real human beings. And that makes it easier to make terrible decisions and stick with them. So you have all these factors combining: ideology that can't be questioned, information systems that hide the truth, leaders whose ego won't let them admit failure, bureaucratic momentum that resists change, and physical and emotional distance from the consequences. Put all that together and you get the Great Leap Forward. You get 15 to 55 million preventable deaths. And here, that's the thing that really keeps me up at night. We haven't solved any of these problems. They still exist today, maybe not in the exact same form. Maybe not to the same extreme degree in most places. But the basic vulnerabilities are still there. We still have ideological thinking that resists evidence. We still have information systems where people are afraid to deliver bad news. We still have leaders who care more about their image than about being right. We still have bureaucratic inertia that makes changing course difficult. We still have decision makers who are removed from the consequences of their decisions. These aren't uniquely Chinese problems. These aren't uniquely communist problems. These are human problems. Problems of how we organize ourselves and make collective decisions. Problems that can show up anywhere if we're not vigilant about preventing them. Look at how information flows in your own workplace or community or government. Are people rewarded for bringing up problems or punished for it? Is there a culture of honest assessment or a culture of toxic positivity where everything has to be framed as a success? When something goes wrong, do people focus on fixing it or on covering it up and assigning blame? Look at how decisions are made. Are they based on evidence or on ideology? Is there room for dissent and disagreement, or does questioning the party line get you ostracized? When evidence contradicts the prevailing wisdom, does that lead to updating the wisdom or suppressing the evidence? Look at accountability structures. When leaders make bad decisions that hurt people, do they face consequences or do they just move on to the next thing? Is there any mechanism for removing leaders who are failing? Or does power, once gained, become permanent regardless of performance? These are the questions we need to be asking. These are the safeguards we need to be building. Because the Great Leap Forward isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a case study in how human systems can fail catastrophically. And the lessons from it are relevant everywhere humans make collective decisions that affect other people's lives. One more thing I want to talk about: the long-term consequences. The famine ended in 1961 and 62, but the effects lasted for decades. The generation that was born during or right after the famine, the people who were malnourished as fetuses or infants, had health problems their whole lives. Higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of heart disease, cognitive impairments, physical development issues. The famine scarred an entire generation physically as well as psychologically. And the social and cultural effects lasted even longer. The famine destroyed trust. Trust in the government, obviously, but also trust between people. When you've lived through a time when social norms broke down, when people did terrible things to survive, when you couldn't trust anyone, that changes you. It changes how you relate to other people. It changes how you think about society and community and collective action. A lot of historians think the Cultural Revolution, which happened in the late 60s and early 70s, was partly a result of the trauma from the Great Leap Forward. Mao had lost some prestige and power after the famine. He wasn't running day-to-day operations anymore. So he launched the Cultural Revolution partly to regain power, but also partly because Chinese society was traumatized and fractured and he needed a new cause to rally people around. The Cultural Revolution caused its own disasters and left its own scars. But it might not have happened, or might not have taken the form it did, without the Great Leap Forward coming first. One catastrophe led to another. The mistakes kept compounding. And even today, the effects linger. China's one-child policy, which lasted from 1979 to 2015, was partly a response to fear of not being able to feed the population. That fear came from the Great Leap Forward famine. And the one-child policy has created its own massive social problems that China is dealing with now. Demographic imbalance, aging population, gender ratio issues from selective abortion. All of that traces back, in part, to the memory of the famine. So when we talk about the consequences of that one decision at Beidaihe in 1958, we're not just talking about the 15 to 55 million people who died during the famine itself. We're talking about generations of effects. Ripples that spread forward through time, affecting people who weren't even born when the famine happened. That's the thing about big policy failures. They don't just hurt the people who are alive when they happen. They shape the future. They constrain what's possible later. They create problems that take generations to solve, if they can be solved at all. Remember that. Remember that the decisions we make today, the policies we support or oppose, the leaders we empower or constrain, those choices will echo forward. They'll affect people who aren't born yet. They'll shape a future we can't fully predict. And that means we have a responsibility to think carefully, to build in safeguards, to stay humble about what we know and don't know, to be willing to change course when evidence shows we're wrong. The four men at Beidaihe didn't think about any of that. They thought they were making a smart decision that would help China develop faster. They had good intentions. They wanted to make life better for people. But good intentions without wisdom, without humility, without accountability, without systems that allow for correction, those good intentions paved the road to the largest man-made disaster in human history. That's the story. That's the lesson. That's what we need to remember and learn from so it doesn't happen again. Because it can happen again. The capacity for this kind of disaster is built into how humans organize themselves and make collective decisions. It's always there, waiting if we're not careful to prevent it. Hit subscribe if you want more deep dives into history that actually matters.